One of the most common ways God speaks to people in biblical history is in dreams and visions. Have you noticed? Over 1/3 of the material in the Old Testament alone is in visionary form, and God speaks almost exclusively in this way in the early church, as we read in the book of Acts. Both dreams, what we have when we're asleep, and visions, when we're awake, speak the language of pictures and symbols. And sometimes it seems rather odd. There's a boiling pot that tilts over from the north, signifying a threatening army. There's a man riding a white horse with a sword in his mouth rather than in his hand, signifying the God who doesn't fight with violence, but with words of truth. The question I've asked myself is, why would God speak this way? Why use all sorts of confusing and sometimes obscure imagery and symbols that need some interpretation? Well, as a master communicator, we would expect that God would select the most effective means to get his messages across. So why does God speak in dreams and visions? I've pondered this question myself over the years, and I've also discovered some truths about how we're made up. Neuroscientists tell us that visual imagery is the most effective form of communication. In fact, we are 6.5 times more likely to remember a message in pictures than we are in words. Advertisers make great sense of that. In fact, the scientists have used MRI scans to see what happens in our brains when we see pictures and scenes before us. And it seems that it lights up the emotional part of our brains, which means that we feel more like we are participating in the scene, and therefore we're more likely to remember it. Perhaps now we can see why God speaks in this way. Let me give you an example from biblical history. This was a time in the 6th century BC when the people of God were in exile. They were in Babylon, far from their home in Jerusalem. Their city and their temple had been devastated. Basically, there was no hope for them. And God wants to speak into that situation. Well, he could have used words, but how does he do it? He speaks to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel sees a scene. There's a great expansive valley, and on the floor of the valley are a whole array of bones. They're dry and they're brittle. They've been there for so long. And Ezekiel is watching this scene, and suddenly he begins to see a wind forming, and it begins to swirl the dust, and it begins to connect with the bones, and suddenly they shake and they move and they begin to connect with each other, and the wind continues to blow, and muscles and ligaments and flesh begin to form, and as the wind blows, the corpses appear. Can you imagine how it felt for Ezekiel? Something like out of a zombie movie. Because the wind begins to continue to blow and the flesh begins to turn pink. And suddenly, these dead bodies rise up in formation, strong and tall and ready to move. Can you imagine how Ezekiel felt? Can you imagine as he saw that scene play out, what God was saying? See, these bones were the dead hopes of Israel. And what was God going to do? He was going to breathe life into them. God was promising a wonderful future. God was speaking about the good plans that he had for them. He could have used words, but he used a scene, a picture. The most wonderful, masterful communicator speaks to us in ways that we can understand, speaks to us in ways that make sense to us, and then that transform us, give us hope and a future in the process. Thanks for listening to Everyday God Conversations today. For more on having your own dreams and visions and understanding the ones that come from God, go to godconversations.com.